The retired K9 broke formation in front of 40 uniformed officers and a rolling news camera. He ran past his handler. He ran past the mayor. He ran straight toward an old man in a faded gray jumpsuit holding a rake, a man nobody in that parking lot could even name. Then the dog dropped to the ground at his feet and refused to move. What happened next would end one man's career and finally, after 20 years, give another man his life back. The morning sun was still low over Ridgeline County when Walter Briggs unlocked the maintenance shed behind the sheriff's office K9 training center. He was 71 years old, and his hands had the kind of permanent stiffness that came from 2 decades of cold mornings, just like this one. He moved slow but sure, the way men move when they've stopped trying to prove anything to anybody. Nobody at the department knew much about Walter. To the deputies who passed him in the hallway, he was just the groundskeeper, the quiet one, the man who kept the training yard mowed, the kennels clean, the fences mended. He wore a plain gray jumpsuit with no name tag, ate lunch alone on an overturned bucket behind the equipment shed, and left before the evening shift ever clocked in. If you had asked any of the younger deputies how long Walter had worked there, most would have shrugged. A long time, they'd say. Feels like he's always been here. None of them knew he used to run the entire K9 division. None of them knew that 20 years ago, Walter Briggs had built that training program from nothing, that he had personally selected, raised and trained the department's very first working dogs, that his name had once been printed on certificates that hung unnoticed now in a storage closet nobody opened anymore. None of them knew what he had lost or why he stayed. Today was supposed to be an ordinary Friday. The department was holding a retirement ceremony in the front lot, the kind with a podium, a few folding chairs, and a cake table nobody would touch until the speeches were over. The guest of honor was a 7-year-old Belgian Malinois named Duke, the most decorated working dog Ridgeline County had ever fielded. 14 apprehensions, 2 narcotics fines that made the 6 o'clock news, 1 tracking recovery of a missing 8-year-old girl that had run in newspapers across 3 counties. Duke was retiring today, and the department wanted it done right. Cameras, a local news van, the mayor standing near the podium in a blazer that still had the fold creases from the dry cleaner's bag, and at the center of it all, Captain Russell Voss, head of the K9 division, a tall man with silver hair and a smile that never quite reached his eyes. Walter watched the whole thing set up from a distance, the way he always did. He kept his head down, pushing a wheelbarrow of mulch toward the flower beds along the fence line. Close enough to hear the noise of the crowd, far enough that no one would think to look at him. He told himself it didn't hurt anymore. He told himself that every year, by 9:30, the front lot was full. Deputies in dress uniforms, a dozen civilians who'd come out to see the ceremony. Duke's current handler, a young deputy named Marcus Diallo, stood at attention with the dog seated perfectly at his left side, harness gleaming, medal ribbons pinned to his collar for the occasion. Captain Voss stepped up to the podium first, tapping the microphone twice. "Ladies and gentlemen, thank you for joining us," he said, his voice carrying easily across the lot. "Today, we honor one of the finest working dogs this department has ever had the privilege to deploy. Duke has served this county with distinction for 7 years, and it's my personal honor, as the man who built this program from the ground up, to see him into a well-earned retirement." Walter's hands went still on the wheelbarrow handles. The man who built this program, he didn't look up. He didn't say a word. He had heard Voss say some version of that sentence at every ceremony for 20 years, and every time, something in his chest tightened like a fist, closing around a stone. He had learned to let it pass through him like weather. You couldn't argue with a lie that had been repeated so many times it had become the truth. He picked up his rake and kept working. That was when Duke's ears went up. The Malinois had been sitting in perfect formation beside Deputy Diallo for nearly 10 minutes. Still as a statue, eyes forward the way he'd been trained. But now his head turned, slow and deliberate, toward the flower bed at the edge of the lot. His nostrils flared. His whole body went rigid, not with aggression, but with something closer to recognition. "Duke, heel," Diallo whispered, tugging gently at the leash. The dog didn't move. Voss kept talking, unaware, praising the department's commitment to excellence. But a few people in the front row had noticed. A murmur passed through the crowd. Duke's tail, low and still a moment before, began to sweep back and forth across the pavement in short, urgent strokes. Then, without any command at all, Duke stood up. "Duke, sit." Diallo hissed, but his voice had lost its command edge, replaced by confusion. The dog took one step forward, then another. The leash pulled taut in Diallo's hand, and for one heart-stopping second, the young deputy actually considered letting it slip through his fingers, because something about the way Duke was moving didn't look like disobedience. It looked like a dog walking towards something he'd been waiting 7 years to find. "Hold him," Voss snapped from the podium, finally noticing his easy smile cracking at the edges. "Diallo, hold that dog!" But Duke wasn't lunging. He wasn't pulling with aggression. He was walking, steady and certain, straight toward the flower bed, where an old groundskeeper in a grey jumpsuit stood frozen with a rake in his hands. The whole ceremony had gone silent. 40 uniformed officers turned to watch. The mayor turned. The news camera swung on its tripod, red light blinking, and Walter Briggs, 71 years old, stood perfectly still as the department's most decorated working dog crossed 20 feet of pavement and stopped directly in front of him. Duke lifted his head and stared into the old man's face. Then he made a sound none of the deputies had ever heard him make. Not a bark, not a growl, a high, trembling whine that seemed to come from somewhere far deeper than his throat, and he lowered himself down onto the pavement at Walter's feet, pressing his whole body flat against the old man's boots, the way a dog lies down beside someone he has been searching for. "Oh my God," someone whispered near the front row. Deputy Diallo stood there, holding a leash that had gone completely slack, staring at his own dog in open disbelief. "He's never done that," Diallo said, his voice barely audible. "Not once. Not for anybody." Walter looked down at the dog lying across his boots. His rake slipped from his hand and clattered against the pavement. His lips parted, but no sound came out, and for a long, terrible moment, everyone watching could see something break open behind the old man's eyes. Captain Voss's knuckles had gone white around the podium's edges. That's enough excitement for one morning," he said, forcing a laugh that convinced no one. "Diallo, get the dog back in formation. Let's continue the ceremony." But Duke didn't move, and neither did Walter. 20 feet away, standing near the news van with a notepad in her hand, a young woman named Emily Briggs watched the entire scene unfold with her heart hammering against her ribs. She was 28 years old, a reporter for the Ridgeline Gazette, and she had come to cover what she assumed would be a routine, forgettable retirement ceremony for the paper's community section. She hadn't expected to see her own grandfather standing in the middle of it, and she certainly hadn't expected to see a decorated police dog throw himself at his feet like a soldier finding a long-lost brother. Emily had grown up loving her grandfather fiercely and knowing almost nothing about him. Walter never talked about his years with the department. When she was a little girl and asked why he didn't work with the police dogs anymore, he would just say, "That was a long time ago, sweetheart." and change the subject so gently that she never noticed she'd been redirected until she was already thinking about something else. Her grandma, before she passed, had once told her, late at night when Emily was maybe 15, that Walter used to come home some nights unable to speak, that something had happened at his job that broke a part of him he never fully repaired. She never explained what. Walter never let her. Now, watching Duke pressed against her grandfather's boots, refusing every command to move, Emily felt something she hadn't let herself feel in years. She felt like the story she'd never been told was finally cracking open. She lifted her phone and started recording. Captain Voss made it to Walter, and the dog in 6 long strides, his jaw tight, his voice pitched low so only the people nearest could hear him. "Get up and get out of the way, Briggs," he muttered. "You're disrupting a department ceremony." Walter looked up at him. For 20 years, Walter Briggs had kept his eyes down around Russell Voss. He had swept floors an arm's length from the man who destroyed his career and said nothing. He had watched Voss take credit for a program he'd built with his own 2 hands, watched him climb from sergeant to captain on the back of a lie, and said nothing, because saying something had already cost him everything once. But something about the dog lying across his boots, whining softly, pressing closer instead of pulling away, made the old fear in Walter's chest feel suddenly very small. "He remembers me," Walter said quietly. "He's a dog. Dogs don't remember people they've never met," Voss said. "He's met me," Walter said. "Every one of them has met me. You just never bothered to notice." A ripple of confusion moved through the nearby deputies. Diallo, still holding the slack leash, took a step closer. "Sir," Diallo said carefully, looking between Walter and his captain, "what does he mean, every one of them?" Voss's smile returned, thin and practiced. "Nothing." The groundskeeper's confused. "Get the dog up." "I'm not confused," Walter said, and for the first time in 20 years his voice didn't shake. "Ask him his name, his real name, not the one you gave him for the paperwork." The lot went quiet again. Diallo frowned. "His real name is Duke. That's what's on his file. That's his work name," Walter said. He knelt down slowly, his knees cracking audibly in the silence, and rested a weathered hand on the dog's head. The Malinois pressed harder into his palm, eyes half closed, tail thumping softly against the pavement. "His name, when I raised him, was Samson. I named him after his father." A murmur went through the crowd. "His father?" Diallo repeated. "Zeus," Walter said. "The first K9 this department ever fielded. I trained him 22 years ago, before any of you were wearing a badge." He looked up, and his eyes found Voss's. "Before some of you decided the easiest way to keep your career was to bury mine." Voss's face had gone the color of ash. "That's enough," he said sharply. "Diallo, take the dog. We're done here." But Diallo didn't move. He was staring at Walter with the expression of a man realizing all at once that he had spent 7 years, never once, asking the right questions about the dog he loved. The rest of the ceremony dissolved into confused whispers and half-finished sentences. Voss cut the event short, citing unexpected complications, and hustled the mayor toward his car with an urgency that only made people more curious. The news crew, sensing there was a far better story unfolding than a routine retirement, kept their camera rolling. Emily found her grandfather sitting on an overturned bucket behind the equipment shed. 20 minutes later, Duke lying across his feet, exactly where the deputies had reluctantly allowed him to stay, at least for now, while the department figured out the paperwork. "Grandpa," she said softly, crouching in front of him, "what just happened out there?" Walter looked at his granddaughter for a long moment. His eyes were wet, but his voice, when it finally came, was steady. "You always ask me why I stopped training dogs," he said. I never told you the truth, because I didn't want you to hate the people I used to work for. I didn't want you carrying my anger around your whole life." He looked down at Duke, running his hand slowly along the dog's scarred flank. "But I think it's time somebody finally knew." Emily sat down on the ground in front of him, her notepad forgotten in her lap. "Tell me," she said, "all of it." 22 years ago, Walter Briggs had been the best canine trainer in 3 states, though he never would have said it about himself. He had come up through the Marine Corps working dog program in his 20s, spent a decade training military dogs for explosive detection before an old back injury forced him out, and then brought everything he knew to a small county sheriff's department that had never had a canine unit before. He built it from nothing. He convinced the county to fund a single dog, a German shepherd he named Zeus, and trained him himself, sleeping some nights on a cot in the kennel because Zeus was still adjusting, and Walter didn't trust anyone else to be there if the young dog woke up frightened in the dark. Zeus became a local legend. Search and rescue finds, drug interdictions that made the department's budget triple in 5 years. Walter trained 6 more dogs after him, each one smarter and more capable than the last, and built a reputation that stretched well beyond Ridgeline County's borders. Russell Voss came into the department as a young deputy 8 years into Walter's program, eager and ambitious, and Walter, who had no children of his own at the time beyond his daughter and granddaughter, took the young man under his wing. He taught Voss everything: scent theory, bite work, handler psychology. He wrote letters of recommendation that got Voss into advanced training courses. He trusted him. Then, on a warm October afternoon 19 years ago, everything fell apart. A canine named Rex, one of Walter's dogs, was deployed on a routine building search during a burglary call. Somewhere in the confusion, Rex broke from his handler and bit a 12-year-old boy who had wandered into the search area against every protocol in the department's playbook. The boy needed 11 stitches. His parents were, understandably, furious. The department needed someone to blame. The internal investigation found that the search area had not been properly secured before the canine deployment, a critical safety failure that put a child directly in a working dog's path. It was, without question, the handler's fault. That handler, on that particular afternoon, had been Russell Voss. Walter still remembered the exact moment Voss came to him 2 nights before the review board hearing, his voice shaking, begging. "Walter, if this goes on my record, I lose my career. I have a wife. I have a baby coming. You built the whole program. Nobody's going to question you the way they'll question me. Just tell them it was a training deficiency. Tell them Rex wasn't ready. Please." Walter had refused. He told Voss the truth would come out in the review, that lying to a board would destroy them both if it was ever discovered, that the honest path, however painful, was the only one that protected them long-term. Voss hadn't listened. At the hearing, Voss testified that Walter had cleared Rex for deployment, despite known behavioral concerns, that Walter had ignored his own written warnings about the dog's readiness, that the training deficiency was entirely Walter's failure, not a breakdown in scene security. He had forged an old training note, backdated it, and submitted it as evidence. Walter, blindsided and unprepared, had nothing to counter it with, except his own word against a man he had trained and trusted like a son. The board believed Voss. Walter Briggs was fired within the month. His pension was frozen pending appeal, an appeal that dragged on for 6 years, and ultimately went nowhere because he couldn't afford the lawyers to fight it properly. His name was quietly removed from the K9 program's history. Voss, meanwhile, was promoted to sergeant less than a year later, praised for his resilience in the aftermath of a difficult incident, and continued climbing the ranks until, 17 years after destroying the man who trained him, he became captain of the very division Walter had built. I lost my house within 2 years. Walter told Emily quietly, his hand still resting on Duke's back. Your grandmother and I moved into a rental. I couldn't get hired anywhere near law enforcement. Nobody wants a trainer with a bite incident cover-up on his record, even a fake one. He shook his head slowly. I took the groundskeeper job here 11 years ago because it was the only position they'd give me. I needed the income. And because, he stopped, his throat working. Because you wanted to stay close to the dogs. Emily finished softly. Walter nodded, unable to speak for a moment. Every dog they've fielded in the last 11 years, he finally said, I helped raise. Not officially, not on any record. But there's a program here, before a pup gets assigned to a handler, where the foundational dogs live in a kennel behind this shed for their first 8 weeks. Bonding, basic obedience, temperament work. Somebody has to feed them, walk them, be with them every single day during that window. I volunteered for that duty the first year I was here, and nobody else wanted it, so it just became mine. He looked down at Duke. I named him Samson when he was 8 weeks old. I taught him his first commands in a language only I ever used with him. I held him the night he was so sick with kennel cough we thought he might not make it. Then they handed him off to an official trainer, put him on the roster as Duke, and I went back to mowing the grass. Emily felt tears sliding down her own face now, and nobody knew, she whispered. Nobody knew you were still doing all of this. Voss knew, Walter said, and for the first time, real anger cut through the exhaustion in his voice. Voss has known for 11 years exactly who's been raising his department's dogs. He let me do it because it was free, because I was good at it, and because as long as I never got credit, it never threatened the story he'd built about himself. Emily looked down at her notepad, then back up at her grandfather. That story ends today, she said. The article Emily filed that night wasn't the community piece her editor had expected. It ran the next morning under the headline, The man behind Ridgeline's K9 legacy has been pushing a broom for 11 years, and the department's top dog just told everyone why. It included photographs from the ceremony. It included a records request Emily had filed that same afternoon for the original 2003 review board transcripts, which, buried in the county archive and untouched for nearly 2 decades, still existed in full. It included a statement, offered cautiously but firmly, from a retired sergeant named Alvin Reyes, who had served on that original review board, and who agreed to speak with Emily once she explained what she'd witnessed at the ceremony. I always had a bad feeling about that hearing, Reyes told her over the phone, his voice heavy with old regret. Voss's testimony changed between his written statement and his verbal testimony in ways nobody flagged at the time. We were young, we trusted him, and Walter didn't have a lawyer fighting for him the way Voss did. I've thought about that hearing more than once over the years. I always wondered if we got it wrong. The article spread through the county within hours. Local television picked it up by noon. By early afternoon, the sheriff's office had received enough calls demanding an internal review that the sheriff himself, a man named Diane Castellano, who had only taken office 2 years earlier and had no personal history with the original incident, ordered a formal reopening of the case. Captain Voss spent that day locked in his office, refusing all calls from reporters, while around him, the department he had spent 17 years climbing began quietly turning against him, one conversation at a time. Deputy Marcus Diallo was the one who found the proof that finally broke the case wide open. That evening, Unable to stop thinking about the way Duke had thrown himself at Walter's feet, Diallo drove out to the county records annex where old department files were stored before digitization, a dusty converted warehouse nobody visited unless they had to. He wasn't entirely sure what he was looking for. He just knew that a dog he had trusted with his life for 7 years had reacted to a stranger in a way Diallo had never seen him react to anyone, and that kind of certainty, coming from an animal that had never once lied to him, felt like something worth chasing. He found the original training logs from 19 years ago in a water-damaged banker's box marked simply K9, Archiv do not disca. Buried behind a shelf of retired evidence records nobody had touched in a decade, inside, among the routine daily logs, Walter had kept meticulously for every dog in the program. Diallo found something else, a separate handwritten note, dated 3 days before the bite incident, in handwriting that clearly did not match the neat block print of every other entry Walter had made. It was the forged training deficiency warning Voss had submitted to the review board, the one supposedly written and backdated by Walter himself. Except the real, original page it had been copied to replace was still there too, tucked a few pages further back where it had apparently been misfiled and forgotten. In Walter's actual handwriting, dated the same week, describing Rex as fully ready for deployment, with no concerns noted whatsoever, 2 versions of the same week, one true. One forged, Dello sat on the concrete floor of that dusty warehouse for a long time, staring at both pages, feeling something cold settle into his stomach. He had spent 7 years trusting Captain Voss without question. He thought about every ceremony where Voss had stood at a podium, calling himself the man who built the program. He thought about Walter, silent behind the flower beds, letting a lie stand for 2 decades, because nobody had ever given him the chance to challenge it. He photographed both pages, and by 9 o'clock that night, he had submitted a formal written statement to Sheriff Castellano, along with copies of everything he'd found. The Internal Affairs Review moved faster than anyone expected. Driven forward by public pressure, Emily's continuing coverage, and Diallo's evidence, which a forensic document examiner confirmed within a week showed clear indicators of forgery on the note attributed to Walter, including ink chemistry inconsistent with the department's records from that period. Sergeant Alvin Reyes gave a full statement recanting his original vote on the review board, explaining that he had trusted testimony he now believed had been deliberately falsified. 2 other original board members, both since retired, echoed similar doubts once they saw the documentary evidence. Captain Russell Voss was placed on administrative leave 3 weeks after the ceremony, pending a full investigation into the falsified 2003 hearing and, separately, into whether his use of an unpaid, off-the-books civilian to perform official K9 foundational training over the past 11 years violated department policy and labor law. He resigned before the investigation concluded, submitting a 2-line letter that offered no apology and no explanation, and left the county entirely within the month. Nobody at the department was sorry to see him go. Several deputies later admitted to Emily, on background, that something about the man had always felt hollow, though none of them had ever been able to say exactly why until the truth came out. Walter Briggs did not celebrate when he heard the news. He sat quietly on his bucket behind the equipment shed, Duke's head resting heavy in his lap, and simply closed his eyes for a long moment, the way a man does when a weight he has carried so long he forgot what walking felt like, without it finally lifts. The department held a second ceremony 6 weeks later, and this one bore no resemblance to the first. It was held in the same front lot, but the folding chairs numbered in the hundreds this time, spilling out onto the surrounding grass. Local news vans lined the street. The county commissioner attended personally. Sergeant Reyes, now in his 70s himself, stood near the front row in a jacket he hadn't worn since his own retirement. Watching with quiet satisfaction, Sheriff Castellano stood at the podium, and beside her stood Walter Briggs, dressed not in his grey jumpsuit, but in a simple navy suit Emily had helped him pick out. 2 days earlier, his weathered hands folded in front of him, Duke sitting calmly at his side, off-leash, exactly where he wanted to be. 19 years ago, this department failed one of its finest members, Sheriff Castellano said, her voice carrying clearly across the silent crowd. We failed him through negligence, through misplaced trust, and through a willingness to protect convenience over truth. Today, we correct that record. She turned to Walter. Effective immediately, Walter Briggs's personnel file has been formally amended to reflect that the 2003 termination was based on falsified testimony and forged documentation. His pension, with full back adjustment for 19 years of wrongful denial, has been restored in full. A ripple of applause broke out, growing steadily louder. And the department is proud to announce that the K-9 Foundational Training Program, which Mr. Briggs has quietly and without recognition run for the past 11 years, will now formally bear his name. Every dog that comes through this department going forward will begin their career in the Briggs program. The applause became a standing ovation. Walter stood very still at the podium, his jaw tight, fighting visibly against tears he had spent 2 decades refusing to let anyone see. "There's one more piece of business," the sheriff said, a small smile crossing her face. Duke has served this county with extraordinary distinction, and as of today, his retirement is official. Under normal circumstances, a retiring K-9 goes home with his most recent handler, if that handler is willing and able. She glanced toward Deputy Diallo, standing near the front row. Deputy Diallo has generously agreed to step aside because he believes, as we all do now, that Duke already knows exactly where he belongs. Walter looked down. Duke was already looking up at him, tail sweeping slowly across the pavement, waiting. "Walter," the sheriff said gently, "would you like to take your dog home?" For a long moment, Walter Briggs couldn't speak at all. He knelt down, slow and careful, his knees cracking the way they always did, and wrapped both arms around the Malinois' thick neck. Duke pressed his head against the old man's shoulder and let out that same trembling whine from 6 weeks earlier, except this time there was nothing uncertain in it at all. "Yeah," Walter finally whispered, his voice breaking completely. "Yeah, buddy, let's go home." The crowd rose to its feet again, and this time, even Sheriff Castellano wiped her eyes as she stepped back from the podium to let the moment breathe. 1 year later, the small house Walter shared with Duke on the edge of Ridgeline County looked nothing like it had before. Emily had helped him build a proper covered porch, the kind with 2 rocking chairs and a water bowl worn smooth from years of use. Though this bowl was brand new, still bright silver in the afternoon light, Walter no longer wore a groundskeeper's jumpsuit. Twice a week, he drove out to the training center, not to sweep the lot, but to run the Briggs Foundational Program exactly as he always had, except now with an assistant trainer, a young deputy who had specifically requested the assignment after watching everything unfold the year before. Marcus Diallo had traded his patrol position for a spot in the K-9 division full-time, determined to learn everything the old man had to teach before it was too late to learn it from him directly. Duke, grey now around his muzzle in a way he hadn't been a year earlier, spent his mornings lying in a patch of sun on the porch, ears twitching lazily at birdsong and his afternoons walking the property line beside Walter with the same careful, watchful gait he'd carried through 7 years of service, except now there was nothing left for him to guard against. Emily visited most Sundays. She had written a follow-up piece for the paper's 1-year anniversary of the story, and it ended with a line she had thought about for a long time before finally writing it down. Duke spent 7 years finding things other people couldn't see: hidden drugs, missing children, danger nobody else noticed. But the most important thing he ever found wasn't a piece of evidence. It was a man everyone had stopped looking at. Sometimes the truth doesn't need a courtroom or a headline. Sometimes it just needs a dog who remembers and refuses to let go. Walter kept a framed copy of that article on the wall above his porch, right beside an old faded photograph nobody outside the family had ever seen until that year. A much younger Walter Briggs, kneeling in a training yard with a German Shepherd puppy in his arms, the very first dog he had ever raised for this county, a dog named Zeus. Duke's father, sitting on the porch some evenings, watching the sun go down over the fence line he used to mow alone, in silence. Walter would rest his hand on Duke's head, and Duke would lean into it the way he always did. And for the first time in 20 years, the old man understood something he had spent 2 decades afraid to believe. Loyalty doesn't forget, it waits. And sometimes, if you're patient enough, if you keep showing up for the ones who can't speak for themselves, the truth finds its way home too. If this story reminded you that quiet, faithful people are so often the ones carrying the biggest sacrifices, consider leaving a like so more stories like Walter's can find the people who need to hear them. If you know someone who's ever been overlooked for doing the right thing, or someone who simply loves a loyal dog, send this story their way. Have you ever known someone whose sacrifices went unrecognized for far too long? Tell us about them in the comments below. We'd be honored to hear it. Every forgotten hero deserves to be remembered. If stories of loyalty, service, and faithful companions matter to you, we'd be glad to have you with us here at K9 Heroes Uncovered.